Now, here, Stiglitz and Friedman both believe that the institutions, public and private, that promote protection of private property, enforcement of contracts, prevention of fraud, correction of externalities, and the prevention of monopoly are good for economic efficiency. Now, just look at this statement. And I hope you'll recognize that a lot of these terms are things you didn't really realize why they might be important. And I hope you have learned a little bit about why each of these things matter in terms of making an economic system work more effectively. And that's, some of the key knowledge you're learning in this course. Now, the difference is, however, Stiglitz believes in more public institutions. Friedman tends to believe in more limited government. And Friedman is worried about the following two things, which I want to highlight quickly. Friedman's worried that government is both inefficient, A, and B, prone to special interest influence. All right, now Stiglitz believes that too, especially about the second point, prone to special interest influence. Let's talk about things. We have a term, it's often used out there, called crony capitalism. And I put crony capitalism up here on the far upper right of the spectrum that I created. And it's right very close to this other term that's sometimes used called fascism. And what crony capitalism is meant to represent or refer to is a situation where you've got private ownership of production, so you've got privately owned firms, but the firms are kind of in bed with government, if you will. And that what the government is really doing is everything and anything that the businesses want them to do. Okay, and what businesses want, you all should recognize, is monopoly. They don't want competition. They don't want anything close to perfect competition if they can get their way. And so what crony capitalism refers to is basically when big business and monopoly profits dominate government decisions and that government is there and beholden to business. This is a real concern even in the US economy today. And I want to highlight that it should be a concern to both the right and the left, because crony capitalism is far away from sort of the mainstream, sort of the standard majority opinion in the United States or anywhere else. Okay, so this is a real problem that we ought to be aware of and we ought to contend with a little bit. Okay, so again, definition, crony capitalism occurs when wealthy special interests use government to create regulations that make it easier to maintain monopoly profits. Now, we talked about Mansur Olson's notion of the logic of collective action. And in that discussion, we explained why concentrated business interests are likely to prevail in democratic societies, while certain government policies are going to generate benefits to a small group, like businesses mostly, and the costs are going to be spread out across the collective, the consumers and the taxpayers, who are not even going to notice that they're being negatively affected. This is one reason why these policies can be put into place oftentimes. And it is the process by which crony capitalism and fascism can develop within a particular economy. And maybe that's something that's going on and that we ought to be really concerned about in our economy in the US today. Now, let me highlight a couple of problems with crony capitalism and distinguish kind of good government, beneficial government on the left from crony capitalism government on the right. And this is where we can say we can't really make distinctions about should we have more government or less government. It depends what government's doing. That's where the distinction ought to be, and that's where the discussion should be. Okay, so what's good for government? Well, all of the things that government does to help prevent the unfettered self-interest and unethical behavior that we described earlier is all potentially good for the economy overall. So provision of public goods like a judicial system, a national defense, local police and fire, roads and parks, public goods. These are all good things that make sense for governments to provide. You know, why provide public goods? Because they're not likely to be perfectly provided for by a private firms because of the free rider problem that arises in that. Okay, we need to have some environmental regulations potentially to keep polluters from going wild. We might need to have common resource management. These are corrections for imperfections are possible, and we can have a beneficial government that does and achieves exactly those things. But what's crony capitalism government? Well, that's going to be things that are inefficient, like putting tariffs on imports. That's likely to reduce economic welfare overall for the country, but it's going to be good for businesses. What about intellectual property protections? Well, maybe that's going to have a positive long-term benefit in terms of innovation and growth, and that's the positive argument for intellectual property protections. But it also gives monopoly privileges to firms for an extended period of time, And a lot of people are arguing that that goes too far, that we're giving much too much intellectual property protection, and it's really in the interest of businesses to promote and to get those rules solidified. Professional licensing, all of the things, and I gave you a little bit of list of licensing requirements that governments have put into place, licensing all sorts of professions, anything from doctors and lawyers, which might make some sense, to licensing beauticians, or and licensing is an ability to restrict entry into the field, which then provides some monopoly power and some rents to be earned in that particular industry. And it's an example of, again, crony capitalism kind of government, because it tends to be inefficient overall in a larger sense. Agricultural and energy subsidies. We don't have a lot of good arguments for how those are improving economic efficiency. It's probably mostly redistributive policies that are benefiting the firms in those particular industries. And they've managed to get government to come along and to follow along and put policies into place to help them. Labor unions tend to do the same thing. Remember that a labor union is nothing more, or at least one element of it, is that it's a monopoly on the labor side of the marketplace. Labor unions can provide good things for the people it's representing, like providing good information flows and make sure that everybody knows what they need to make good decisions. But labor unions also act like a monopoly. They restrict entry into the industry. They try to maintain higher wages, and it can be inefficient, again, unless you're correcting for another market imperfection like a monopsony in the labor market. Price gouging laws, inefficient in terms of their application, but widely supported by lots of people. Public schools, we're not going to get into the discussion of that, but there's a long history of discussion of whether public schools are efficient or not, whether we're really providing for, and creating a good outcome with public schools rather than private schools. And you can read up a lot more about that. Tax code complications. I want to mention one point really quickly here, and that is that one of the things we're talking about public policy-wise today is to raise taxes on the wealthy. All right, and sort of the knee-jerk reaction for most people is, well, that's good. The rich are making too much money. Maybe they've got monopolies and they've got monopoly rents and profits, and we got to tax them more. So let's just raise the taxes on wealthy people. The problem with that argument is that the tax code is really, really complicated. And oftentimes, if you propose something like, let's raise the marginal taxes on individuals making over $2 million up to 50%, let's say, what they're going to do is the lobbyists are going to come in and say, okay, well, we'll accept that 50% marginal tax increase. That's fine. But, let's change the tax code over here and over here and over here just a little bit. And by doing these other changes, which are not reported and not known to anyone really, except the insiders, what they've done is they've now figured out a way to say, well, we're not going to get affected by the higher tax rate because we're going to shift our income and we're going to classify it under these other codes, these issues in the code, and we're going to be able to avoid taxes completely. Why does Trump not release his tax forms? We got information that his taxes were only $750 a year ago or two. And he's arguing why? Because I'm smart. Because what does that mean? I'm using the tax code to try to eliminate my taxes. Or he just doesn't have any income to report because, again, you're shifting your income around. And we should never forget that the wealthier individuals have the ability to hire tax accountants and tax lawyers who went to the best schools in the country and can read these complicated tax codes and figure out how to minimize taxes paid by their companies. All right, problems with government inefficiency. Okay. A government provides services. Think about, I want to kind of contrast a government with a private business. A government provides services that are demanded by the political system, not because individuals walk into a store and say, I tell you what, I'll pay you this much money if you give me the goods I want. Okay, the government is doing things because of the political process. And so we have to be careful of saying government should do this and just implement it, because anything we suggest, for example, like putting a higher tax rate on wealthy individuals, has to go through the political process before it actually gets implemented. And it's in that process where the sausage is going to get made, so to speak, where all these extra added things are going to be thrown into the tax bill so that others can divert their money in different places so that they're going to be able to come out ahead. And also, what governments do is not always the will of the majority. And here I'm going back to Mansur Olson's point that it's the special interests, the moneyed special interests, that are more powerful in the political process. So we're not going to get necessarily government outcomes that are going to match what's in the best interest of the general public. Now, a government receives revenues on the other side, though, from the threat of punishment, okay? They get money to pay for the things that they're doing by taxes. And you can't, as a consumer of the government, you can't not pay your taxes, because if you don't, you're going to be fined or imprisoned, or if you don't. And so there is a punishment forthcoming if you don't abide by the rules of the government. And this is what, on the far right, people are really concerned about. They say government is theft. They're just taking money away from you. You have no choice in the matter whatsoever. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. You do have some choice in the matter, because you can go to the polls and you can vote for elected representatives. But that's a very indirect way of expressing yourself. It's not as direct as, I don't have to buy the bread at this bakery because I could just not go into it and not pay the money. You don't have that choice with government. And that means the flow of money into the government is commanded, if you will. And so therefore, businesses, unlike businesses, governments do not need to provide valuable services all the time. I mean, they could provide unvaluable services for a long period of time, and there's very little competition that's going to put them out of business. Okay, and here I just have a quick reference to the Postal Service, USPS. Compare it to FedEx or UPS in terms of their efficiency in providing mail services to individuals. FedEx and UPS does a great job, and you pay for it, and they're making money. USPS does a similar job, but they don't do it while making money. The USPS post office has been losing money for the last 10 years or more, and it's very difficult for them to keep up with the likes of FedEx and UPS. Problems with government's inefficiency. Governments tend to maximize spending. It's important to recognize that. They have very little incentive to do things efficiently. And in fact, what government agencies all do, they have a budget this year, and their goal is to increase that budget next year. Government agencies would never say, oh, we've got $10 million to spend, but we could do it in $8 million. We don't need to spend all of it. They would never do that. They're going to spend every last dollar, even if it's inefficient, because they need that in order to guarantee that they get an increase in their budget next year. Now, I've got a quote here, but he said, quote, incredibly, whenever I proposed the theory that half of government workers could just be cut, he says, current and former federal employees I know have all agreed. They've all said, yeah, you could get rid of half the government workforce and the government could continue to do everything it's done before. This is a popular impression for anybody that's worked in government before. And I can say, I've talked to lots of GW students who have worked for the federal government over the years. And whenever I talk to them, they'll make statements like this. They'll say, I work in this office, and there's 3 or 4 people that seem to do everything. I mean, there's some people who are like movers and shakers, and they're concerned about what they're trying to provide, and they're trying to do the best job possible. So there's a lot of good government employees. But he said, but they would say, the student would say, but like 80% of the people I don't know what they're doing. Like, I have no idea what their purpose is in this particular office. And that is a common experience across lots of different government agencies. Although I will say not all. The one agency that I've met lots of individuals and connected with sometimes is the U.S. State Department. U.S. State Department is great in a lot of ways, and they provide a lot of valuable services to Americans. You're going to learn in your political science courses, if you haven't already, about soft power and how having U.S. officials abroad, kind of spreading the American principles of democracy and elsewhere, kind of building up our reputation in the world is what the State Department can do and does do. And what happens? The State Department is often the first agency to get cut whenever budget cuts are coming down the road. So there's one agency where I think works pretty well, but it's hard for them to continue. Now, our discussion of ethics in economics has almost ignored inequality. So why isn't inequality the focus? And in fact, if I talk to economists and say I'm talking about ethics in economics, the first thing they'll think is, oh, you're talking about inequality. Well, we didn't talk about inequality a lot in this course, but here's why. And that's because I think inequality is the consequence of all the other unethical behaviors. Theft, deception, fraud, when it occurs, means the winners of those exercises take advantage of others, and it creates inequality. The biggest cause of inequality, I think, today, though, is because of the monopolizing behavior of firms and the ability of firms to use government to get advantages for themselves. Okay, and that's creating greater profits for firms, and it's creating the inequality. There is a Stiglitz article that I assigned to you in the monopoly section, where basically he talks about how monopolies have grown enormously big in the United States, and it's a big contributor to the inequality that continues to rise in the US. So it's because of this that we're getting inequality in a big way. Negative externalities, polluters take advantage of others, again, creates inequality. Discrimination in markets, advantage of some over others, it creates inequality. So basically, there are two approaches to deal with the economic inequality that's out there. Number one, raise taxes on the wealthy and redistribute to the less wealthy. Okay, that makes intuitive sense. But here's the problem. First of all, it's going to promote resentment and counter lobbying by the rich. Here again, try to raise taxes, extra provisions will be thrown into the code, and suddenly you're going to realize that you can announce you have higher tax rates on wealthy individuals. Sounds like a political success, but really in the background, all of the firms and rich people know that they're just going to be able to shift their money somewhere else and not pay any more in taxes. That's often how it works, or at least we ought to be aware that that's a problem and try to prevent that from happening if you're going to try to put this policy into place. It may promote dependency by the poor. This was a problem way back when, where we were worried about if you just give money to people because they're less wealthy, then they're going to become dependent on that, and they're not going to work hard, they're not going to participate in the system, and that's a problem. And the problem is that this is just keeping the inequalities. The reasons for the inequalities continue to be there when you're just trying to correct for the inequalities by taxing and subsidizing. Okay, the alternative down here is to go after the causes of the inequality, the monopoly provision that's taking place, the gains that others are arising because they're using theft, deception, and fraud, and so forth. Use government maybe, use private mechanisms maybe, but try to eliminate the causes, the underlying causes of those inequalities, and then inequality is going to be greatly reduced as a result of that.